I can tell people like, yeah, eat your vegetables and exercise, and I can just be prescriptive and I can cross my arms and that's the end of that conversation. But nobody knows their body and their lifestyle more than you, right? Like, so it's just better when you get information that's just equipping you to make the right decision for yourself.
That's the Washington Post's Ask a Doctor columnist, Trisha Pasricha. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Don't forget to hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you find this conversation or any others you've heard valuable, I have a favor to ask you. Consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more of the conversations that you love. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. As regular listeners of the show will know, I've recently gone through one of the biggest changes a person can experience in life, becoming a parent. I am obviously so excited to share that I'm a brand new mom of a beautiful baby girl. And while I'm adjusting to my new life as a mom, I'll be taking a little bit of time away from the show so I can be fully present for her and my family. Don't worry, you'll still hear me in conversation with a fascinating guest each week, just like you always have. But you'll also be hearing from my producers, Grace and Emily, on a more regular basis. They'll be stepping in to set a little bit of context for each of my conversations. So with that, let's start the show.
Okay, welcome to part 2 of our mini-series on demystifying health and wellness trends with Dr. Trisha Pasricha. Trisha writes the Ask a Doctor column for the Washington Post. Emily, can you give us a quick refresher on what we talked about in last week's episode?
Yes. So last week, Leah and Trisha talked all about the biggest trends in wellness. Everything from leaky gut and seed oils to continuous glucose monitoring.
So this week, we're talking about how we can get better at vetting health information ourselves. Because unfortunately, Trisha can't be with us every show to answer all our questions. First, Trisha will walk through how she, as a doctor and medical journalist, goes about doing her own research. And then she'll share some strategies that we can use to assess the quality and reliability of a source or piece of health advice. She'll talk about some of the red flags to look out for, and also some of the green flags that indicate what you're reading about or watching is probably solid information.
Trisha is really the perfect person to have this conversation with because she is a doctor, but she also participates in the social media wellness space. She makes videos for TikTok and Instagram, so she gets what people are coming to the internet for when it comes to wellness. So, for the second time, here is Dr. Trisha Pasricha.
I want to take a step kind of like out into the general space of like health information. It's like most people don't ever get the chance to talk to someone like you and ask you specific questions and say like, tell me about this, this, and this, and just get curious. And so, of course, a big part of what we're doing on this show is giving people access to information that is, and people who are trustworthy and reliable and can share things that I think we may not have access to for the most part, and also that gets confused because there's so much out there right now, and we have so many different ways to learn about whatever it is we're learning about. And I put learn in quotes because we all know that there are some nuances there. I'm curious about how you would describe today the quality of a lot of the health information that's out there for the general public.
You're right that it's a really murky landscape out there. And it can be so hard when you're a patient, you're suffering, or you're trying to improve your life. And there's nothing wrong with trying to seek out your own information and trying to vet that. But it's difficult because, like maybe 20 years ago, you would have these encyclopedias, you'd have textbooks, you could go to the library and you could pretty much trust a lot of what you were getting in those vetted resources, or you would just talk to your doctor, right? And I think now there's a million different websites. A lot of them look pretty legit, or personal blogs. There's a lot of medical or health influencers. A lot of them look pretty legit. And they're often saying wildly contrasting things and giving recommendations that you're like, well, what is this based off of? And then there's a lot of people who, the most sort of dangerous ones to me are the ones that start with this kernel of truth. I mean, I think that's the best kind of information, misinformation, is it starts with a kernel of truth. It lures you in with some buzzword that feels right. Like they'll say a term like microbiome or endocrine disruptors, or these terms that you're like, oh yeah, I've heard about this. The scientists are talking about these concepts. And then they just very quickly veer off the kind of charted path of what the data shows us. And maybe they give solutions and answers that are no longer verified by studies. But because they started it, they grounded it in something that does have a scientific validity, the rest of what they say starts to sound logical too, even though we veered away from that, like minutes ago into this video. And I see that all the time. And sometimes my patients come to me and they'll show me this influencer and their opening statement will be like very valid. But then it just quickly devolves. And I think the thing to keep in mind, so for example, I work at the Post. I'm the Ask a Doctor columnist, and I have my own background that I think makes me an expert in both medical journalism and scientific research. And I think that helps me with the articles. But, one thing to know about the Post and a few of these other institutions is that it's not just my word you're getting when I write something, right? So everything I write at the Post, it's vetted by at least 2 editors off the bat. Then it's fact checked by another set of editors. And then we have a whole team who's sort of reading it. We're full of experts who write on our staff, who say, oh yeah, this doesn't feel right, or it does. And part of the process as a journalist, which is a little bit different than people who write a blog or who are just kind of professional influencers, is you're trained as a journalist to get both sides of a story, and in science, I think this is also what makes a good journalist, makes you a good scientist, is that you have to sort of be open to the idea that the data is not going to be perfect. And what do those gaps look like? And talk to the people who are on the other side of the issue. And so you're getting a full story that's looked at all angles. And you can appreciate that because they're answering to these ethics of both journalism and medicine, and they're representing a bigger institution. And I think I would trust that information a lot more. And sure, I think that comes with the price of sometimes you might read my articles and you'll say, I didn't get this straightforward, like, yes, I should absolutely do this. It's definitely going to work. This is going to cure a thing. And I think that the thing is that that's because there's rarely a cure-all in medicine. The truth is sometimes that something is not a guarantee. But here's what we know, and that's what we try to share with people.
Well, I mean, to your point at the beginning, it's like there is generally no magic pill. So anyone who's saying there is, most of the time is probably not sharing a full truth. And I think there's so much hyperbole, especially online today, is like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever had in my life. This is the best thing I've ever done. Right away, this did this. And that's what captures our brain, our attention, right? Because you go, oh my God, this happened so fast. We like that instant gratification. And it bothers me so much. I like hate to sound like a curmudgeon who's like an older millennial who's like, well, we shouldn't be. But it feels like, no, that not everything is that. In fact, most things aren't that. Yeah. And most influencers will be saying tomorrow that something else is their favorite thing because they're probably being paid for it.
Well, I think you've brought up 2 good points. I mean, one is that in the kind of social media landscape of things, like when you're going to a webpage and you're reading information, you scroll, you take all the time you want, you soak in the information, you click on the links. In my own articles, I always hyperlink to the original study if someone wants to read further. On social media, on these videos, TikTok, Instagram Reels, an influencer has 3 seconds to hook you or you're going to keep scrolling, right? So you have to say something that's really arresting, that's really like, wow, shocking. You want to keep watching. You don't usually do that by saying like something that's like really wishy-washy and hedging. It's like, the data's not so great about this. Well, why would you keep watching then? But if you say, this one thing changed my life, here's what you need to know. Suddenly you're like, wait, what changed your life? I need to know. And you have about 60, these videos are short, maybe 60 seconds. You don't have that much time to sell nuance. You're really trying to sell, a real story. And so it's, I don't think anyone should get their primary information from a 60-second TikTok video at any point because you just there's no way you can have had the time to understand the nuance.
I want to talk to you more about like how we as consumers think about getting better at vetting information. But I want to first understand, more about how you do that. So like, as we've clarified, you're not sitting in the dark at like a desk when you get an Ask a Doctor request and just kind of typing back and then going, great, looks good, sending it off. There are multiple steps. There are editors, there are fact checkers. Even you as a doctor and as a medical journalist aren't doing this alone, which is really it's obviously not that I didn't trust you, but it's incredibly reassuring to know, right?
Yeah. And I'll also say that, my broad expertise is internal medicine. That's what I'm board certified in. So I feel very comfortable with a lot of different questions, cardiology, pulmonology, gastroenterology. I love these things. If there is a whiff of me saying, you know what, I'm not totally sure. I'm not as familiar with this entire field that this question is falling in. I call 2 or 3 experts and I get their quotes, I get their takes. And this is a principle of medical journalism, is you really try to call experts who might have different takes on it, because you want to hear the whole picture, right? So I'll go through the literature and I'll say, okay, who's published, who's really doing research in this field, who's written commentaries in the medical literature that counter these results, who have this argument against it. Let me talk to everybody and really hear out what the whole argument is, and then put together a picture so that, my goal is to always try to equip people with all the information that I have so people can make the best decisions for themselves, right? And in my own clinic, I meet patients wherever they want me to meet them. If they want to be told what to do, sometimes people are overwhelmed and they're like, just tell me what you do. And I say, okay, if you were my mom, if you were my sister, here's what I would tell you to do, what I think is the right thing. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, people are allowed to make decisions for themselves. Where I'm going with that is just that I think when you're just working in a bubble by yourself, you don't talk to a bunch of different people. You don't have lots of different input. I feel really glad that I have that from my editors, from my colleagues, from the other doctors I interview. I think you can suddenly become very prescriptive and narrow-minded because you're just constantly reinforcing your own ideas all the time. And then often I think you accrue followers who love to hear what you're saying, because often what you're saying resonates so strongly. Like you're identifying a need and you're filling it. What you're filling it with may or may not be something that's truly helpful, but you're meeting them, in a place that they need to be met at. And which is why I think we need more people in there who are giving a more balanced perspective, offering something else, but that's not just saying, look, everyone else is wrong, you have to listen to us.
What do you think's so hard about you specifically say, and as a journalist, it's like you are reaching out to and looking for different viewpoints when it comes to a story. What do you think the struggle is about when it comes to trying to digest multiple opinions? I think that's part of the reason that a 60-second video on any social platform works, is because we typically only get one viewpoint.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. And I think it's hard. Even in my column, I have 800 words, if I write too much longer than that, I lose people too. People's time frames, their attention spans are short. I think there's a big disconnect between people want answers quickly. They also want an individualized answer that really speaks to their unique question, their unique problem. And what you're going to get online in a video that's going to be seen by 1 million people, it's, like when I make these reels, that it's speaking to a huge audience. It's going to speak to a lot of people. It might hit, like a good percentage of people's situations. It cannot hit everybody's. It cannot perfectly describe everybody's situation. And I think the problem is this disconnect between what we can get so quickly at our fingertips online and the extreme difficulty of getting personalized information from a doctor you trust in person. Right? It's so hard to make an appointment. When you get an appointment with your doctor, it's 15 minutes.
Right.
And there's lots of reasons why, but they're certain groups, women often just don't get a great relationship with their doctor. You don't always feel you can trust your doctor, but then you're going to wait 6 months and try to get another one. It's so hard to get somebody who knows your whole medical history, your background, your questions, and can give that to you. It's so much easier to just scroll through social media until you try to find an answer that you like, the one that clicks with you, right? And it's not that anyone's doing any of this consciously or deliberately trying to fall for misinformation. Nobody's trying to do that. It's just that we're desperate for answers and it's hard to get them through our current healthcare system. And I think that's the shortcoming of the healthcare system. That's why a lot of people, even these established institutions, are moving into trying to reach people online, because it's just, we know that's where people are getting information.
Right. Right. And I mean, like, it's sort of, yeah, you've kind of said meet people where they are. And one of my questions for you is there a place for people? You know what I mean? Like, there's, when I say is there a place, I mean, there's, for now, there's not going to be a massive shift in the fact that there are people out there who are influential, that people have decided to make specialties out of their level of influence as creators, that they're going to then try to make a living off of being a creator. And so they're going to be fueled by this economy that's kind of popped up in the last 10 to 15 years. So, like, is there a positive place for influencers to live in our kind of mental landscape of where we get information?
Yeah, I think so. I think, the flip side of this is that so many times I feel like I see people who've maybe read my column or seen other people's content online, and they've either emailed me or I see them in clinic and they'll say, like, I went my whole life not knowing that other people were going through what I was going through. I thought that I was alone in these symptoms. And then I discovered this online community of people who had this same symptom, right? Or they'll find that their symptoms were being kind of like dismissed as one diagnosis, and seeing a video, seeing something opens their mind to the possibility that there's a different diagnosis out there. I think having an open mind and learning about medical topics and seeing what could be true is steps in the right direction. I think it's when you latch on, you lock in, and someone takes you down a dark pathway that, and then eventually you end up buying a lot of products or signing up for their master class on something.
That's when you've crossed over.
That's when you go too far. But I think just getting the idea is that you then bring up with someone you trust, which I hope we get to a place where that is your doctor again. I usually tell people who write to me with their medical questions that are hyper-specific. They're not really actually looking for me to write about it online in a column. They really just want me to answer their personal medical question. I usually write back and say, like, I can't. No, not because I don't want to, but because even everything you've described to me, one, let me just say it would be illegal, unethical, but two, it's not enough information. I need to be able to ask you more questions that are pointed. I need to be able to do a physical exam. I need to have this rapport with you, this relationship in which you feel like you can trust me and share some of these details. You're not going to get that with an online influencer. You're not going to get that even with me, just as a columnist who I hope you can trust, but you need to have a relationship, and the word is relationship with your doctor, so that they can kind of be attuned to when things change in your health and come back. But all of which is to say all the things that you learn online can be helpful and start conversations. Bring them back to someone that you can have those nuanced conversations with, and really say, okay, I've learned about this new concept. Maybe it's leaky gut. Maybe it's about the microbiome. Maybe it's about, like IV hydration, like whatever it might be. Do you recommend that? And if you do, what would be the right steps? If you don't, like, why not? And if you trust that person, and that speaks a lot more to what someone online who doesn't know you might be able to tell you.
Coming up, how to read an academic study. Trisha breaks it down step by step. We'll be back in just a few moments. And we're back with medical journalist Dr. Trisha Pasricha.
The last time you and I spoke, we talked about cortisol and like what cortisol really is. And because right now it's buzzy and it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much cortisol in my body. It's really crazy, or it's really bad, or it's actually okay. Like everybody's got a different opinion. It's very possible that I may hear that and I may not have immediate access to a medical professional I trust that I can speak to. Maybe the appointment's a month off. I want to know how you would advise most of us who are kind of like the lay people to go about trying to understand more. Like, what would a step-by-step process look like For those of us who maybe don't know how to read research papers, don't know where to start, don't know the difference between peer-reviewed, meta-analysis. Like if we Googled, we would go, oh my gosh, what's happening? Like how would you do that if you were us?
Yeah,
I know it's a big question.
I'll acknowledge that it's overwhelming. And if I had the answer, I think we would live in a world of truth and no misinformation. And I don't think that's the world we live in. But the most basic rule of thumb is like, does it sound too good to be true? If it sounds too good to be true, like that's always a little bit of a red flag. But when you're thinking about who's a voice of authority that you can trust, well, I think it's helpful to think about who else is backing what this person is saying, right? Like, so if there's someone who's talking and they're giving information, is what they're saying something that if, you go to the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, or maybe the webpage of a big academic center. I don't work for the Mayo Clinic, but I cite them always as like a hospital that I feel is very, very trustworthy. They have a great reputation. And Mayo has a lot of kind of web pages that answer health questions.
I use them a lot.
I use them a lot too.
Yeah.
I think they're wonderful resources for patients. Are those really trustworthy big names that represent a big institution? Are they saying similar things, or is nobody mentioning this like kind of weird kind of secret herb that this person said will fix a lot of your problems? Why is nobody else mentioning that? Again, usually I tell my patients who are not in my field that find a few places that you trust and just stick with them, right? Like, so maybe for you, it's the Washington Post. Maybe for your friend, it's the New York Times. Or maybe it's neither of those things. Maybe it's the National Institutes of Health website, right? Actually, they do a really nice job of making web pages about some of these popular topics because they're aware that these things are like, they have pages and pages about popular supplements and they cite the data, they explain the studies. Pick these places that you feel that we can trust for all the reasons that we've talked about, and try to filter out for just a minute, filter out what else is happening on social media and just go back to some authority figure that is not just one person. When I say figure, someone who's answering for a broader group of professionals who are being held accountable, whether it's the NIH, which is being held accountable to the taxpayers, the Washington Post, which is being held accountable by the entire industry that it represents and the public trust. And see what they're saying about it. And I think you will find most of the time is that those places that you go to, what you've heard on social media is so black and white. And when you go to these web pages, it's going to feel a little harder to read because it's not going to be black and white at all. It'll be like, well, this study showed this and it's pretty good for this, for some percent of patients. On the other hand, it may not work in this scenario. And it'll feel gray. That's correct. That's feeling of like,
supposed to feel like.
It's supposed to feel like, wait, this may not work for every person every time, but it's showing promise in this specific scenario. That doesn't feel as satisfying, but that is what real science is. And that's what to look for. And I think, again, if you go, you don't have to be an expert in reading studies. And I certainly caution people, like you can make mistakes if you try to read studies without having a good grasp of what the methods mean and what the conclusions are. I think most people, though, could give a stab at reading the discussion and conclusion section of a study. And that's usually what the authors themselves have written that puts together the summary of what they want people to take away from that study. Usually that section has been vetted. It's been peer reviewed, meaning so the authors have said, this is what I think the conclusions are. And then the peer reviewers who look at this manuscript are like, you guys, you can't draw that conclusion. That's too hardcore. Like dial back a little bit in what you say. And then you edit it and you dial back a little bit. Or you say, make sure you talk about the limits. We always have a section. It's usually a paragraph in that discussion that talks about what are the limits of this study. You have to say that in any major research paper.
Wait, and I'm going to pause you. So, because there's two things I think people may not know. First of all, who is peer reviewing? Like how does someone qualify to be a peer reviewer?
Oh, great question.
Like, how do we trust that?
Usually the way it works is a lot of these academic journals, their editors are big researchers in the field. So the editors, and they solicit peer reviewers who are also researchers in the same field as the paper's topic. And so these are people who, if you were to write in about cortisol, they would say, you know what, this person, I've seen them publish in the last 10 years some really great research about cortisol signaling. Let's ask if they would review this paper. So you get invited to be a peer review by the editor of a journal. And, like any scientist will tell you, they don't always agree with you. They could be your rival, and that's really lame, but it happens. And it's actually good when you have someone who doesn't necessarily agree with you. They might still say, yeah, this paper is worthy of publication. Put it out there. But this is what I think we need to be really clear that this is what the limits of the paper are. And so every author this is a standard format of how one writes a research paper. In the conclusions or the discussion section, you write what the take-home point should be. You dedicate a whole paragraph, usually about a paragraph, to what the drawbacks of your study are. You could say, we only studied this drug in females. We didn't look at men. So we don't know, we can't necessarily apply this to the broader population. You might say, the way we designed the study, we looked back in time at events that happened in the past, rather than us randomly assigning people going forward to an intervention. That introduces bias. You own that. You say that.
Right.
And so it really summarizes nicely what I think the take-home points are, but also what you as a reader might say, okay, you know what? They're saying here in the limits that probably this is a study that really applies to older women. And I'm a young guy. Maybe this is not going to be the one that I need to be thinking about. That can be helpful. So I think it's hard. You can get lost in the jargon of the methods section in the biostatistics. You need to know that if you're going to be someone like me who's really rigorously trying to look at these studies and distill them for the public. But if you just want to know, what do I need to know? What's something that the editor of the journal has looked at, at least two peer reviewers, if not three, have looked at, and that the authors are trying to tell us, to read the discussion and see what you make of it. It can still be really jargony and filled with scientific terminology. It's not always going to be easy, but I think that's the most accessible place to start.
Okay, so I'm gonna play this back for you for people who are going, okay, I do want to find more information, and I like, I'm the kind of person that would be like, I want to be educated. I don't really want to wait to have to talk to someone who's like, here's what you should do, because I like just learning. So your recommendation is, you might hear something, and we can use the cortisol example. And the idea is that first you go, okay, what are the places that I know I can trust? And then the next thing, which makes a lot of sense, right, is find out who or what group could be held accountable for what they say about it and see what they're saying. So many influencers are not actually held accountable, really, to a larger body that's reputation rides on them.
Yeah, there's nobody, I think, for a lot of influencers, there's nobody fact-checking their scripts, looking over their content before they hit, they upload it. They might have a team of people. Some of them are, obviously very successful.
Of course,
They might have a team of people producing the videos, getting the shots. But truly the content, the scientific content, often that's one person. When that's the case, you have to take that with a big grain of salt compared to someone who's working for an organization where there's a big team of people who are working on the scientific content of it and saying, let's make sure that we're not just, presenting one side of this. Let's really make sure we've done, and it's often not, again, one side. It's not necessarily that there's always just two opposing sides saying totally different things. It's more in the case of cortisol, you might say, well, let me talk to a neurologist and a pediatrician. I want to hear what the effects in childhood could be like. I want to hear what the effects on our mental health or our brain can be like. And you just want to hear all the different angles. Influencers are sometimes just sticking to one line of reasoning, and you can kind of miss some of that nuance.
Right. Okay. So that's a big one, is saying who's held accountable and how can I be better at probably allowing information in that maybe I don't agree with or doesn't feel good, because that's, like you said, part of what gets us drawn to certain people is oh, that feels good. That feels right. But a feeling is not a fact. So, it's how do we push ourselves a little bit to get there? And then you said asking yourself the question of some version of, does it feel gray? Does it feel black or white when I'm being presented with, or does it feel a little bit gray? And the gray is probably where you're going to find more of the truth.
Yeah, there's few things I think a lot of times, many questions that people write in to ask me is how can I cure my X, Y, or Z?
Right.
The word cure, I mean, just to be clear, in medicine, we almost never cure anything unless it's an infectious disease, right? Like we make diseases better. We treat symptoms. But that's just sort of a fact of how the world works. And it's not as nice to hear that.
No, nobody would. Most people are like, no, I want to be fully cured.
Yeah, exactly.
I felt that way about anxiety. I was like, when I first really realized what it was and that I was experiencing it, I was like, oh, I want to cure this. And I went on this like whole thing about how do I cure it so I never feel it again. And I think I remember like the first time a psychologist that I was interviewing said something like, the goal is never to cure the anxiety because you simply won't. Like you will not have a full cure. And by the way, you're supposed to experience anxiety as a human. Like that's a norm. And I was like, oh. I was like,
That's
I
not
want to
the
go
answer
back
you
to
wanted.
And then the last piece, which is we're looking, when we do find a study, we may not be, and as you point out, if we're not as maybe educated in how to read through a study, we could actually do ourselves a disservice by trying to piece everything apart. So the value can come in looking at the discussion, conclusion, and I love this, I didn't know it, looking at the limits of a study and saying, okay, in this context, here's what they found, but in another context, it could have been different.
Exactly. And sometimes the limits, again, that's not going to say that every time an author doesn't slightly overblow their conclusions and that makes it through peer review. That can happen, and it doesn't mean that every limit is a fatal flaw. Like I mentioned, someone might say, this was a retrospective study, meaning we looked back in time. This was not a randomized control trial. They'll write that as a limit. It is a limit. That doesn't mean we need to throw this study out. It actually could be that that's the best way to do this study. It could be because the randomized control trial would be unethical. But there will be some people who will say, well, that's not the gold standard. And it's literally, taking the information that you have and then saying, but in the context of the real world, in the clinical picture, what's meaningful? What's feasible? When in doubt, write your question down and bring it to your primary care doctor to just say, like, look, I came across this study. Have you heard of it? Like, is this valid? And then even if your appointment's 3 months later, just keep that list. I love when patients bring in like a quick list of the questions that have built up over time because it's hard to get an appointment 2 weeks from now. But then we can just go through them real quick and we could say, oh yeah, no, this study, it's actually a fantastic study, even though it has this one limitation, I probably wouldn't trust these results for these reasons.
Just a quickie on the idea of kind of like the spectrum of harm or not harm that influencers are doing. If I'm an influencer who's doing what you just said, let's just say I have a question about cortisol and I want to talk to the people who follow me about it. And I go through this process you just went through, and then I go onto Instagram or TikTok and say, so, I followed this process and I found in the discussion conclusion these things. I found some limits, but here's what I took away from this study. Is that okay?
I think it's okay. I don't think, I'd like to believe most of these influencers are not out there to harm anybody.
No, of course not.
I think they believe that they're offering something valuable. They often believe in the message that they're, spreading. I think they do. And I think, again, even if they're saying, here's the exact study, here's my interpretation, you still want to ask yourself, is this person the right person to be in? Like, do I believe their interpretation? And do I think that the way they're interpreting the study is in line with how other experts feel about it, right? And again, some of that comes back to the NIH, for example, will have interpretation. Like they often say, here's the data and here's what it means. That we, I know a lot of the big news organizations do try to, we don't just throw the facts out there. We try to say, look, this is what it can mean. And we're interviewing lots of people to make sure that take is appropriate. Whether you take the advice or not, I don't make money off of it, for example,
Sure.
And certainly I think most doctors who are in a practice setting, you see them at a hospital or something, they don't personally gain when your health gets better. That's their job, is to help you in that individual moment. When you're an influencer and you get more followers, you get more companies to sponsor you, you're selling the certain message that gets you more endorsements, there is a personal gain, even if it's not direct. Yeah, it's an influence. And so I think just asking yourself, what is this person going to gain if what they're saying is true or not true, even if it's not a monetary gain? Is it like they're building this brand around this idea that's in this sphere of influence, and they're staying on this one brand? People who are influential are not always wrong, but it is something you should just keep in mind.
So I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements for me. The first is better humans are.
Oh, I like this game. I think maybe better humans are content with their health choices.
Better work is.
Better work is meaningful work.
And a better world has.
I think a better world is one in which people live a higher quality of life.
I love that. Dr. Pasricha, thank you so much. It's been great getting to talk to you in these two parts. I could chat with you all day long, and I also just appreciate you sharing, your honest opinion about how we approach the information that we see everywhere about health and wellness, particularly at a time when there's so much out there, there's so much misinformation. I think you're giving some level of guidance, of course, through your column, but also really good guidance here about how we just start thinking about this in a way that is hopefully beneficial to all of us. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
That was Dr. Trisha Pasricha, the Ask a Doctor columnist for The Washington Post. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is hosted by Leah Smart and produced by me, Emily Reeves.
And me, Grace Rubin.
Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. Tim Boland mixes our show. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova and Ali McPherson. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Coop is head of original programming, and Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. Thanks for coming with us, and we'll see you next week.